your father was Trevor Ainslie Evans,
Right.
and I know from looking up on the internet that he was born in 1879 in Montreal,
Good for you.
and that his father was the Dean of Montreal, the Anglican Church Dean of
Yeah.
Montreal, right?
Yeah, right.
So he grew up in a household. I think you've told me religion was a very important part of his life, given that his father was a man of the cloth.
Yeah.
And
Perfectly true.
other than that, I know very little about his childhood. I can, again, from looking at the old census forms, I can see that he lived with. He had 3 siblings. A brother Basil,
Well, Basil was the
or 4 siblings. I'm sorry. A brother Basil,
and
a sister Muriel or
Yeah.
Molly,
yeah,
another sister Ruby,
yeah.
and another brother Cedric, I believe, who died as a child.
What's his name? Cedric.
Cedric, I believe.
No, I don't think it was Cedric. Oh,
Anyway, did your dad ever tell you any stories about what his life was like as a child? I mean, he would have. I think they lived in downtown Montreal, likely, right? Was it on University Avenue, I
yeah,
believe?
Yeah, yeah. See, I don't remember as much of all this as I used to, but I think my father never complained about anything, but I think they did have a difficult life. They certainly had to watch their money very carefully, because I think his father used to try to help people who needed the money more than he did, and
But his mother came from a fairly well-to-do
Yeah.
family, though.
yeah, no,
And you said they had to watch things carefully. According to the census forms, they had at least 3 servants living in the house with them, so they must have been fairly well off, Gran.
yeah, I think they lived very well. You know, you've got me stuck here.
Well, that's okay. Well,
Never
we'll
too
talk
much
we'll
about
talk
it.
through it. But your dad never related stories of his youth. What he do.
Any stories that he related were all happy stories. There was no unpleasantness about it.
You don't know where he went to school, for example?
Well, I don't think it was a private school. It would have been a public school in Montreal.
Okay.
And I think he did well enough. I never heard him complain about anything.
Do you know if he ever went to university or not?
No, I don't think he ever went to university.
Okay.
Uh,
And when
What?
you knew him, he had his own. He was an insurance broker, was he not? He had his own business.
yeah.
And
Well, did he have his own business?
my understanding is he was an insurance broker, and he had his own business
Yes, he did.
down on Saint
Yeah.
Sacrament Street in
Yeah.
Old Montreal.
Yeah, and I can remember him saying so often he was worth more dead than alive. That's a terrible thing to remember. Phoebe and I thought that was a funny thing to say. Who wants to be dead? Meaning that he worked, enjoyed his work, was satisfied with his work, but it was a time when money was scarce, I think, and.
Well, your memories of him, as I think you have told me, would have been mostly in the 1930s, which would have been the heart of the Great Depression.
Well, there you go.
So,
That's
and I remember you telling me one time that he would come home at the end of the day, and your mother would say, "How was biz, dear?" And he would say, "Biz is bad,"
Yeah,
because it must have been very difficult during the Great Depression for a lot of people.
a lot of people lost their jobs and had to move out of their nice homes into something a little less costly. And I think as far as my mother and father were concerned, mother was the one with money, if you want to talk about money. She inherited money, her family was very well off. And dad's family, I think, gave any of their excess money away. They were churchy people,
Mm-hmm.
and I don't think lived the kind of life that mother's family lived. I never heard Dad complain about anything, saying, oh, that rotten person, or they were mean to me. Nothing but happiness.
He was very good natured, in other words.
Oh yeah, and a terrific sense of humor. I mean, when Phoebe and I, if we'd been doing something wrong and somebody scolded us, and we'd be crying and whatnot, well, Dad would sit down and start talking and say funny things, and we'd try not to laugh, Oh yeah, I remember that. He was full of fun. If he came in and somebody was crying, he'd just take about 2 seconds to make them start laughing again. Yeah, he was.
Now he had, as I say, he had an insurance business in the 20s and 30s. You don't know what he did when he first started working, when like in
When
the.
they were married?
Well, if he was born in 1879, he probably would have started working somewhere 1900, give or take.
All I know is he never went to university.
Okay.
He had to start working right away. I don't know if he even got through school, but because money was scarce and he had to get a job.
Okay. And we also know that he fought in the First World War.
Yes, he did, and was wounded.
And he was a lieutenant, was he? Do you know what his rank was?
I don't know. He was lieutenant. What did he call himself? Or what was he called?
But he was an officer in the First World War.
He was a light officer in the First World War, definitely.
Yeah. And he was wounded in action in France.
Yeah.
You're not sure where though, right?
I have no idea where. Absolutely no idea where. And I don't know where all the pictures we used to have photographs of him. I don't know what happened to them. And you see, Dad didn't like too much to talk about the problems he had in the war. He didn't want to upset his little children, and so we'd ask him questions, and he sort of joked about a lot of it, because he didn't want to upset us, but he certainly was very severely wounded. And Mom, of course, was a nurse during the war too. She wasn't wounded, but she had a busy time, and as a nurse and seeing I was going to say, well, people who were unhappy and badly wounded.
But your dad was, I think you told me that he was wounded in action, and he was so badly wounded he was lying on the battlefield for quite a long time before the medics came to, or before he was found and the medics came to treat him. So he was conscious but basically unable to move.
Yes.
And
of course, the roads in those days, not running with cars the way they are today. It was just, I think he was lying on a just unpaved road, after the battle had been there. And by himself. He said by himself, but maybe he was semi-conscious and there were people around him. I don't know.
And do you know if do you have any idea if he recuperated in France and returned to his unit, or was that the end of the war for him? Do you know, after his injuries?
I think that was the end of the war for him.
So he was probably sent home after he recuperated?
I think so. Yeah. And his little children, let me see your scars, Dad. No, he had bad scars on his chest.
But he wasn't, he wasn't disabled in any way after he recuperated?
Played golf, played tennis, played fun little games with us.
He was a member of the Beaconsfield Golf Club, did I hear that? Am I correct?
I guess it was the Beaconsfield Golf Club.
Yeah.
He was a member of a golf club, must have been Beaconsfield. And he taught us how to play golf the way we played, which wasn't very good, but still. But I remember what things I remember about Dad. He and Mom would talk business together, and of course that meant nothing to us. And Mother was just as interested in his work as he was, and encouraged him. And he was very, very. Mom always thought a little bit over generous with his money to his family, to his children, but we kind of liked that.
Yeah, why wouldn't you?
Well, Mom had more money than he did, and she was sensibly generous, I'll put it that way. Thought that Dad overdid it a little bit sometimes. But, you know, I never remember those two. I won't use the word, I will use the word arguing. They conversed and, you know, discussed things, but there was never unpleasantness.
Mm-hmm.
Rather
They
extraordinary.
got along very well together.
Oh, yeah, oh, yeah.
Now, I also heard stories that he, because he had his own business, I guess he was a member of the St. James Club in Montreal, was that right?
Yes, he was.
And would often socialize with his business confreres after
Oh,
work, and
Meant a lot to him, his club. Meant a lot to him, yeah. Very much so. And I guess when he came home, he discussed it with Mom a little bit, but I don't remember him talking about names, oh stupid old so-and-so, and things this, that, and the other thing. But James Club meant a heck of a lot to him. And Mother too, the telephone would ring, and it's Dad on the phone, Mom. Well, Dad would, sorry darling, and I think I'm just going to stay down and have a bite of dinner with so Mother waiting for him at home for his dinner. That used to annoy her a little bit.
mm-hmm.
I guess Mother didn't make the money. I guess we had a maid in the kitchen at that time. And Mother would go in, all right, Mary, say, le dîner prenez maintenant, or something like that. And no, I can remember that distinctly because Dad had found some friends and he thought he'd stay down there for dinner.
And I can't remember if it was you or Auntie told me too that he always wore a shirt and tie.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Oh, definitely.
Like always, even on weekends and evenings, and I think I remember Auntie telling me even at Tadoussac, if he'd go down to he'd have a shirt and tie on.
Yeah, you're quite right. And the tie was, what is a tie you wear when you're sporting? This is a special kind.
An ascot?
Maybe.
Not a bow tie.
Maybe. I don't remember that, but it wasn't the tie that he wore to work.
Okay.
The tie that he wore to work is.
But he always had a collared shirt on too.
Oh yeah, oh definitely, definitely.
And you said when you were at Tadoussac, he could only come down for short periods of time. He'd come down on the boat for a weekend or just a couple of days, and then have to go back because his business required it, I guess.
Perfectly right, perfectly right.
And boat would have been the only way to get to Tadoussac in those
at
days,
that
the
time.
steamship.
Yeah, you're quite right.
Yeah.
But it was wonderful for us kids. Oh, Dad's coming today. We'd run down to meet the boat, and of course he was always out on deck. We'd see somebody waving. There he is, there he is. You know, to have memories of happy family is really something. Not everybody does that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, they were devoted to each other. That was obvious. They never. I mean, they sat and argued about something, you know, but in a nice way. They never spat at each other. Put it that way.
Mm-hmm.
So it left us with happy memories, And it was difficult for Mom though, because Mom was brought up with money. The family was well off, and they spent it. And then Dad had to watch his pennies, so Mom had to watch her pennies. And I think it must have been hard for her, don't you think? You know, she'd be generous as well as she could. But anyway, they had good times together, but Mother didn't do any sports. And of course Dad loved his golf. We never played tennis, except Phoebe and I said, come on Dad, let's play tennis. Well, he did a little bit, but not very much.
But he used to play tennis at Tadoussac or in Montreal?
Dad?
Yes.
It was in probably both places. Where we played with him was just for fun, Ted, I think, just to see him play tennis.
Mm-hmm.
But he wasn't young at that point. He was running, maybe difficult for him. And
Well.
he could swim too. He'd take us swimming. So no, he knew all the fun activities.
Well, he was just doing some quick math, but obviously he would have been over 40 before he had any of his children were born.
Yeah, he was, you're right.
Yeah. I heard a couple of interesting, you related a couple of interesting anecdotes that I've heard about your father over the years. One, you told me, as we said earlier, that he was very religious.
Yeah.
And you were telling me that during the First World War he was marching his troops somewhere along a road, and he saw an apparition telling him not to go ahead. Or do you recall that story? Yeah. Can you relate it?
Yeah. He obeyed the whatever it was, and he turned around and went.
It was like an apparition, was it, that came to him, all in white? Did you tell me?
I don't remember that part, but he was leading his group, and this thing came to him, and he tried to forget it and say, "Oh, absurd! You don't do things your mind tells you to do that way." But it kept on and on and on, so he finally did take a turn around, and that place was bombed to pieces. They would have all been splattered all over the place.
Mm-hmm.
That's quite a story, isn't it, though?
Well, the other story that I heard a long time ago was that he was over in Europe in 1912 and getting ready to come home, and he had an opportunity to book passage on the Titanic.
Yeah.
And a voice told him, don't.
Yes.
And so he changed to another vessel.
Yeah.
And I found it quite interesting. Again, poking around on the internet, you can look up old records of passage, and I did find out that he was booked on another vessel right at the same time that the Titanic sank. He was coming across on another ship. So
how did you know he was?
Because you could see the date, the ship he was on, where it sailed from and where it sailed to, and what the dates were. And it was right at the same time that the Titanic sank.
And you found that by looking
on the internet.
For heaven's sake.
Yeah.
So he wasn't just
the chances are there was some truth to that story.
Yeah. No, I remember him telling us that, because we didn't, we were just kids at that point.
Mm-hmm.
But I guess the Titanic just went down with everybody in it.
Well, not everybody, but over half. I'm sorry.
A few people were saved.
Oh, 1,000 people were saved, but there was 2,500 people on board, so they didn't have lifeboats for most of them. So over 1,000 of them were lost.
Yeah, and even if grandfather hadn't been lost, it would have been a miserable time for him.
Well, if he had been on the ship,
yeah,
given that he was a man, he
Yeah.
likely would have been lost, because
Yeah.
it was, they put the women and children first in the lifeboats, starting with first class and then second class, and a lot of the steerage or third class passengers, even the women and children, did not survive.
Terrible, eh?
It was terrible.
Yeah, well, that was true.
So at Tadoussac, you said your dad he would only come down typically for a few days at a time.
Yeah,
I know I've been told that he liked to go down the path to the beach, and he would fly fish for salmon, or for trout, I guess,
Yeah.
for sea trout off the beach at Tadoussac,
yeah.
which is something that isn't done anymore, that's for sure.
And
Um,
you know, he wasn't in slacks or anything, he was in a business suit, take his jacket off, yeah, but I can see him there, probably.
And he would play tennis occasionally at
Yeah.
Tad. Did he play golf at Tadoussac
Oh,
too?
yeah, he
Yeah.
loved his golf,
Okay.
yeah,
But so he would have a full couple of days whenever he'd come to visit, it sounds like.
yeah, and only a few days, that's
Yeah.
right, a week if he was lucky, yeah.
So
And the excitement, we'd run down to meet the boat, and as it came up towards the wharf, we'd see little movement somewhere. That must be him, I think he's waving to us.
comfortable telling the story of your dad's passing?
Dying?
Yes.
Golly, my mind is not what it used to
Well,
be.
you and your mother went over
yes, we
to England to visit
That's
your
right.
mother's stepmother, right?
That's
Your
right.
mother's stepmother had been, I think, diagnosed with. She was dying herself,
You're quite right, yeah,
and you accompanied your mother over
yes,
because your dad couldn't leave business-wise.
yeah, you're quite forgotten.
And I think your sister Phoebe was in her last year of school
Yeah.
and couldn't go, so you went instead.
Yeah, I
Okay.
remember being there,
Okay.
and I remember when mother went to.
So you went by ship across the Atlantic and
Yeah.
visited your
Yeah.
mother's stepmother.
Yeah, Aunt Mom's mother,
Yeah.
right. And then she did get that. Somebody came, we were both seasick.
You were coming back. You were coming back from Europe,
Right,
and you were in the middle of the Atlantic
Yeah.
on a steamship.
yeah. I can remember being in that cabin. The two of us were in the same cabin, and being, not vomiting all over the place, but not wanting to go out near people, and Kate, we were both feeling
Seasick.
very seasick. And somebody knocked on the door, and what was it that,
The story you told me was that one day a ship's officer knocked on the door
right,
and came in and asked
Oh.
to see your mother and said, "I have bad news for you, Mrs. Evans. Your stepmother, who would have been Mrs. Rhodes, I guess,
yeah.
has passed away." So,
Yeah, because the man came in and, didn't he say, "How are you," or something? And, anyway, that's what happened, mother said.
and that wasn't a
Okay.
surprise because you knew she was very ill, right?
Oh, yes, mother was dying, mother's stepmother only had a little while more to live, and that's why mother went over. She asked mother to come over, she wanted to see mother, and gave her a few, I guess, pieces of jewelry, I don't know what she gave her.
Uh-huh.
No, that's, I remember that distinctly, being there, being in the cabin with mother, because we were both sort of seasick, and somebody knocking on the door, and introducing himself as the doctor, and mother sort of laughed and said, "Well, we're certainly not very well, but I don't think we need a doctor." I remember that distinctly. So he said, "Well, I'll just sit down for a few moments with you, if I may," and announced as pleasantly as he could that mother's husband had died.
Well, but first day, they came and announced that Dorothy's stepmother had died, right?
I'd forgotten that.
I think you told me that they knocked on the door and told you that the stepmother had
Yeah,
died,
that's
which
what I'd
was
forgotten.
which was not a surprise.
Yeah,
And
and we
then
went over to see her because
Right.
she was going to die.
right, and then either the next day or 2 days later was a knock on the door again. Is that not right?
It's perfectly right.
And I don't know if it was the same man or not who came
I
in.
don't remember that, but Mother was saying, we really don't need a doctor.
Right, and again, you had related to me that you thought maybe he was coming to say the same news about her stepmother,
Yeah,
and, well, you already told us type thing.
no, I
But
remember
then,
sitting down, and we thought he was going to be, why are you sitting down? We don't want to see you, sort of thing.
uh-huh,
Yeah,
and announced that your dad had passed away,
Yeah.
which of
And
course
Mother-
was
Mother just
devastating
sat
news.
there. Just sat there looking for a long time, and then all of a sudden she broke up. Oh, Trev, no. That almost killed her, it really did.
And
Oh,
even though my memories of Doris were of a very kind, warm lady, I'd heard that she never was quite the same after that. Is
It's
that?
true, perfectly true. She used to, was young, she used to have a wonderful sense of humor and keep us laughing and going and whatnot. No, it did.
Well, she did have a good sense of humor. My recollection of her,
But you never saw her, you didn't often see her laughing so much that she couldn't
well, I
control
couldn't
herself.
compare it to what it was like before,
Yeah.
but certainly she did
Anyway,
laugh.
that's all true.
And she basically after that always dressed in gray or black, really, right?
You're right, oh, definitely wouldn't wear colors.
Yeah.
And from then on, for some reason, we had to watch our pennies, I don't know why.
Well,
But,
your father would have been in his late 50s and still working, so
yeah, no, at one point.
and
we
he had
seemed to
died.
be well off.
And he had died suddenly of a heart attack. Is that
Yeah.
that right?
Yeah, when mother and I were away.
Yeah.
Poor Mom.
Well, your mother. Your mother was born in 1892, and I'm guessing you're saying she had a difficult childhood because her mother passed away when she was just an infant, right?
She never knew her mother.
She never knew her mother.
No.
No, and her
Brother.
father, Armitage Rhodes, was the Rhodeses, I gather, were very well off, and as Armitage, the oldest son, I guess he was in a very favorable position in that regard. And although I think your mom's parents were living in Montreal when she was born,
Right.
but after her mother died, they moved to Quebec City so that your mother's
Their grandmother.
grandmother could care for her as a young girl. Is that not correct?
Yes, that's correct, now that you're reminded me.
So they lived, they had an estate in Sillery called Benmore, I believe, right? Where she lived as a young girl?
That's quite right. With cousins being brought up by her father, but by her, I don't know, it was a grandmother or aunt or somebody who brought her up.
Probably.
No, Mother didn't have a happy childhood, I don't think. In fact, I know she didn't have a happy childhood. And then she was sent to boarding school, fairly young.
She went to Compton, right?
Yeah.
And she spent all her school years at Compton, as far as you know?
Yeah,
And Compton was a private girls' school in the Eastern Townships,
yeah.
which
And she,
merged with Bishop's College School and is now a co-ed school.
I think it is.
yeah.
I think it is. No, Mom met some good friends there, schooled with some good friends. Of course, Shirt is the main one that she enjoyed to be with, but there were others too. So she really didn't complain about it. I think Phoebe and I listened because we were living such a different life, everything so happy. We loved our family life. and we wondered how Mother got by being so lonely and not happy all the time with adults and no friends her age. Funny, eh?
And after your mother finished schooling, she went into nursing, correct?
She did, at the Montreal General Hospital.
So she did her nursing training at the Montreal General
Yes,
Hospital?
She did,
And she also went overseas during the First World War
yeah,
as a nurse?
yeah.
But you're not sure where in
Oh, I have no
France
idea.
she would have been stationed,
No,
or,
I don't think I have any old letters. I like to keep old letters, I think they're interesting, but I don't know what I did with Mother's old letters. I'll have to look that up. Yeah, no, that's where I think that's where she met Shirt, of course, when.
well, she met Shirt at Compton, you said, right?
At Compton, yeah, but Shirt and she.
Shirt's real name was Harriet Ross.
Harriet Ross, yeah, it was Phoebe who named her Shirt, cause she couldn't say Harriet. You remember her, eh?
I do remember her, yes.
Did you ever know her age?
No,
No.
she would have
She'd be
died
long
long
by
before
then.
AJ would have come along, yes.
Okay. See, you know more than I do now at this point. But, no, Mom loved her family, as I've told you this, and she preferred to be home with her family than go gallivanting in the social world. That's as I remember her, and she would buy Phoebe and me new clothes, but very seldom did she buy herself a new dress. Phoebe and I felt a little bit embarrassed sometimes the way Mom didn't dress beautifully.
I know that feeling, Gran.
What? You shouldn't say that.
Now, your parents, they likely met at Tadoussac. Do you know if that's where they really met?
Oh gosh, now that's a good question.
That was gonna be my question.
Because your father's father was the Reverend Lewis Evans. He was the summer minister at the chapel in Tadoussac for
Yeah.
many, many, many years, which
Yeah,
I guess that's the reason the Evanses started to go to Tadoussac. Is that correct? Because he had been asked to
I don't know.
run the services at the chapel.
I would think so. That's something I never thought of, but I think it's probably very true.
And your mother used to spend summers at Tadoussac for
Yeah.
her whole life.
That's where they met.
So that is where they met
I'm
then.
pretty sure that's where they met at Tavistock.
And do you know if
But
they had?
Yeah,
Sorry,
I was gonna say Dad was quite a bit older than Mother.
he
so-
would have been 13 years older than your mother.
Yeah, and of course he'd be probably golfing and tennising, did play tennis in those days too. And Mother never did any of that because the person that brought her up.
So you don't know whether they were dating before the First War or not? Because when the First World War started, your mother would have been 22, and your father would have been 35.
Well, they certainly knew each other from Tavistock, whether
Right.
they were dating, I can't answer
Yeah. And they would have married probably around 1919 or 1920 probably?
that. I guess Phoebe was born, I think, the year after they were married. When was she born?
She was born in 1921, May of 1921.
Okay. I think they were, I don't know the year they were born.
They were married, you mean?
I mean married. I do not know.
And they were married in
Right.
Quebec City,
In
right?
Quebec
In the
City.
cathedral, Anglican cathedral in Quebec City?
Just a quiet personal wedding, private wedding.
Mm-hmm.
Mother was not dressed in beautiful wedding gowns. I think she was living in Quebec with her grandmother at that point, right? I think so.
I don't know if her grandmother would have been still alive at that point. I don't think her father would have been still alive.
No, I don't think her father was still alive. Well, if she was living in Quebec before she was married, who the hell was she living with?
Who the heck?
Eh?
Who the heck? Who the heck was she living with?
Yes. Oh golly, I've got, now I'm losing it.
But you said your mother never played golf or tennis at
Never.
Tadoussac, so
Never.
she would take you to the beach, I guess.
Yeah.
Do you recall any other, how else she would enjoy her time at Tadoussac?
She was always with us. We went on picnics together. Mom would get up a picnic for us. And the house, you know, was fairly large, and we were allowed to have friends out for meals anytime we wanted. And what else? Well, she was strict enough, didn't want us to get into trouble. But I can still see her as children taking us down the path, the big path to the beach, with her knitting bag in her hand, and Mom dressed, you know, with shoes and stockings and dress, and sitting there on the beach watching us have a wonderful time in the water.
And once you got older and were doing things with your friends, do you know how she would busy herself at Tadoussac?
Well, I think we didn't have a maid perhaps at that point. She would pick flowers, she would, what else did she do? Walk through the woods, exercise the dog, visit a friend, relation, clean the house. I shouldn't say this, but Mother didn't care what she wore.
Well, she always, my
She
recollection of her, she always wore a skirt. I don't think I saw her once in her life wearing a pair of slacks.
I don't think she had.
And she always wore either black or gray, but she was always certainly presentable. She was never shabby.
No, well, that was a reason for that. She never got over my father's death, I tell you that. We used to say she never laughed again, because Mother used to get into terrible laughing jags. She could hardly stop, and I never saw her do that again. Oh dear. But she was strict, you know. We did what Mother told us, or else. Boy, she knew how to spank us.
We've heard rumors that on occasion you might have been the recipient of some spankings on a bare bottom. Is there any truth to that rumor?
That we got spanking on our bare bottom?
Yes.
Well, we certainly did. That's where we got spanked. A hand spanking meant nothing, but over her lap, near the bare bottom, oh boy, we got swung.
Well, you must have been horrible little children then, were you?
Steve and I were very polite and when we wanted to be, but we did a little bit of telling lies too, and then we had to have our mouth washed out with soap to wash all that.
And did that work?
For a while. No, well, never mind, we were loved. She would spank us and we'd cry, and then she'd grab us and almost cry herself and hug us and kiss us. And gave up all her money really to please us and to have us taught in a good, expensive school.
So in terms of your mother's family, your mother was the only child of her parents. They adopted a boy named Charlie, I believe.
I think so.
And Charlie never married.
No, I don't think Charlie was, there was something, we never met Charlie. There was something, he was not, I don't know whether he spent too much of the money, I don't know what happened to him.
But he never married and
No.
never had
No.
children.
No,
And
not
after
to my knowledge.
your mother's mother passed away, her father remarried and had
What was her name? Well, that was
Katie
Katie,
Van Ifflin,
yeah,
or Von Ifflin, Van Ifflin,
yeah, Von,
Von Ifflin,
yeah,
and he had 2 daughters with
yeah,
Katie Von Ifflin,
yeah,
the oldest of which was Monica,
yeah,
and Monica never married or had children,
no,
and the other was Armitage,
Armitage.
who everybody called Peter.
Well, ridiculous, Armitage is a man's name, a surname, where it came from, God knows.
So that was too masculine, so they decided to call her Peter, is that right?
I don't know, we didn't,
And then Peter had 1 daughter, so which would be
who was that?
Anne Hargraves, who is your
My,
half first cousin then, I guess,
Yeah.
right?
yeah,
And that's really the only
and
other
this-
progeny from your grandfather Armitage Rhodes.
I think so,
Yeah,
I think so.
and your
If I'm gonna think about it, and if I'm wrong, I'll tell you,
pretty sure about that.
yeah.
And your father had an older brother named Basil,
Yeah,
who married and had 1 daughter
right,
named Catherine, or Kay,
yeah,
who was
poor old Kay.
salt of the earth, very warm, giving person, but
Well,
she
she
never
was.
married. She never married either, right?
And she was never educated.
Well, she was a nurse.
Yeah, but I don't think she went through school the whole way. Well, she couldn't have been a nurse if she didn't, but she was,
She told me when she was going to school, she was left-handed and
Right.
started to write left-handed. And that was not allowed apparently. She used to get rapped on her hand with over her knuckles with a ruler by the teacher to make her learn to write right-handed, even though she was naturally left-handed.
Poor thing. Do you remember her?
Yes.
Kay?
Yes.
What do you remember about Kay?
I remember that she was a very, very kind person.
Yeah.
But you're right. I mean, she always dressed well and was very friendly, but I wouldn't have used the word polished to describe her. Would not have used the word polished to describe her. She
Not
was.
the sort of person you would introduce to your best friend in the
Well,
world.
I
No.
wouldn't have a problem with that, but she was not terribly worldly, perhaps.
Yeah, well, her
But she was as
language
kind.
wasn't too good.
She was
sometimes.
as kind a person as you'd ever want to meet, which is
Well,
the
I
most
agree.
important
I
thing.
agree. We used to laugh at her behind her back and be ashamed of her with their laugh and when she talked to people. But poor soul.
Yeah.
That's the way she was brought up.
And
Or
your
was
father
it-
had another sister named Ruby,
Oh
Who?
gosh, Aunt Ruby.
and she never married, right?
No,
Or had children.
I had a good sense of humor. Fat, warm, but Aunt Ruby, you know, they were different. They were different.
She was a Jehovah's Witness or something, was she not?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I remember Dad was horrified when he heard that.
Even though her father was a churchman.
Yeah, Aunt Ruby's father was my father's father.
Right.
Yeah, right.
Aunt Ruby was your father's sister,
Yeah.
your aunt.
Well, you know, Ruby and her sister, Monica.
No,
No,
Muriel
Muriel.
or Molly.
Aunt Molly. No, and Mom all had the same money from their parents, what money there was.
Well, your mother would have been in a different family, though.
A different mother, but the same father.
No.
My mother's.
Your mother was a Rhodes,
Oh yeah, you're quite right.
and Ruby and...
And the Rhodes had money and the Evanses didn't. Yeah. Anyway.
And your other aunt, Aunt Molly, she married and had 2 children, I guess, right?
There was the nice Aunt Molly and the Aunt Molly we didn't like.
Well,
Which Aunt Molly do you mean?
Yeah, the nice Aunt Molly was your father's sister.
Right.
And the less popular Aunt Molly was Uncle Basil's wife.
Right.
But the Molly you did like had
Three children.
3 or 2?
I think she had 3, 2 boys and a girl.
Oh yes, you're right, absolutely right, yes, yeah.
And I don't remember their names.
Lewis?
Basil and
No. Lewis,
yeah,
Miles,
that's right.
and
Catherine? No, Aunt Molly. No,
she married Ken Thompson. Aunt May,
that's right.
cousin May.
Very nice. We love cousin May.
They were all very nice.
Yeah, they what am I going to say? Lived well, but I think they all were not laden with too much money, I'll put it that way. They had to watch their P's and Q's.
You seem to be focused a lot on money, Gran.
Well, money meant a lot to everybody, and the money that my father had, he looked after it pretty well. He didn't, he used to worry about his sisters spending money on things they didn't need, I'll put it that way.
So you're suggesting they came by their Scottish heritage honestly then?
Scottish parents,
They came by their Scottish heritage honestly.
Yes, I guess.
Scots have a reputation, rightly or wrongly, of being frugal.
Yeah. Well, they weren't frugal. They used to spend money that my father thought they shouldn't have been spending.
Well, your father was frugal.
On some things, yes.
Well, that's the gist of what I'm getting of what you're saying.
Yeah, but he earned money, and he married a girl who had money. So, but he had a very funny sister and a very funny brother, so I remember them. Anyway, they were good people. They were just a little bit different.
Any other stories you can relate about that you know about your mother or her childhood or growing up? You know, she obviously served as a nurse during the First World War. I guess you don't know if she was overseas for a year or 4 years or
I
not.
have no idea how long.
And,
I would have said longer than a year.
Okay.
I would have said most of the time. Mother, I'm not going to say enjoyed it, but was determined to go, and it gave her at that point, something to, I don't want to say something to do either, but I think she and Shirt went together. They were there for quite a while. And you see, Mother had nobody to stay, kept her at home. I think her father had gone at that point too. Anyway, she never complained.
Now, when your parents were first married, they lived on Parkside Place in Montreal.
I don't know if that was when they were first married. When Phoebe and I were there, we lived on Parkside Place. I think when they were first married, I don't know where they lived. I don't think it was Parkside Place, because Parkside Place was too big a place for 2 people. I don't know where they lived.
But when your first memories of a child were living on Parkside Place.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And
Happily, it was a nice place for children. And we had friends there, and we used to play together. There was a great big lawn in there. Houses went round and the big lawn that we played with in front there. Yeah.
And then you moved to Upper Belmont Avenue.
Yeah.
Do you remember the street number on Upper Belmont?
791.
791 Upper Belmont.
Mm-hmm.
And do you know why they moved from Parkside to Upper Belmont in Westmount?
I seem to remember they got some money somewhere from somebody. I mean, felt they could afford it, I'll put it that way. And I'm sure Mother inherited some money, I don't know how.
Okay.
And I think she bought that place on Upper Belmont.
Okay.
Where she got her money from.
And how old were you when you moved roughly? Do you remember?
We weren't at school yet.
Okay, so
I don't think Phoebe was at school either.
you had been very young then.
We were very young.
So pretty well all your growing up years with your parents was on Upper Belmont.
Oh
then.
yes, most definitely.
Yeah.
And of course, when we went to school, we were way down on Guy Street, below Sherburne. And we walked, Phoebe and I walked, because if we walked, we could keep the money that we would have spent on streetcar tickets.
Mm-hmm.
So Phoebe and I walked every day, and that was a long way. We walked down. Dad would call for us to drive us home. But
You wouldn't have walked out to school when you were 6 or 7 years old, would you? Or
were we that young when we went down to that school?
did you go to another school before Miss Edgar and Miss Krantz?
No, we went to a kid's school somewhere. But I guess when we went down there, we were probably, oh God, how old would you be? 12-ish? Because one started school at about 6 or 7 years old, didn't one?
Right.
We certainly didn't walk down there by ourselves, I don't think. No, Dad used to drive us down, and then we were told if we wanted to walk, we could save the money that we would have paid for streetcar tickets.
So
And then Dad would call for us and drive us home.
now the whole time you were at that school, was it in the same location? I know it's
Oh, yeah. Moved.
After you graduated, they moved to a different location.
No, it was an old house,
Uh-huh.
lovely old, with wonderful property, had their own tennis court and places to play. It was a very nice place. Yeah, it's gone now, I think.
Yes,
I forget the owners, forget who they were. But we certainly had very strict teachers, especially the people who owned them. Miss Edgar and Miss Cramp, we were terrified of both of them. I don't know why. I remember Mother invited them for tea one day. A friend of theirs was, I think it was Shirt or somebody, who was staying with Mother, so Mother asked them to tea. And she said, no, you, Phoebe, you and Aim will have to stay and say, how do you do? So we sat at the window watching them come. I remember that, it was over yesterday. Of course, they were very pleasant, very pleasant.
So it was a all-girls private school.
Yeah, and it was very, very costly. I know my mother and father saved their money to send us to that school. They thought it was very important.
Now, how big would the class sizes have been back then?
Never any more than 10. Sometimes 3 or 4.
In a class?
Yeah, in a class. Mostly sort of maybe 6 or 8.
Hmm.
Never 10. Never 1. No, it was a good school.
And just about all your classmates who were in your grade, you stayed in touch with and kept as friends for.
Yeah, and our classes, sometimes there'd be 3 in the class, never more than 10, but sometimes, usually sort of 6 or so. You know, and how many would be in your class, 12-ish?
Oh no, at least double that.
Really?
Yeah.
You see, that's what money